Good evening. It's great to be with you this evening. Can you all hear me? Is mic on? Hello? There we go. Good evening. It's great to be with you, and I'd like to thank Regent University for hosting tonight's debate. I would also like to thank Mr. Shabir Ali and his organization for inviting me to debate him. Mr. Ali is certainly a very experienced debater and is certainly one of the most articulate ambassadors of Islam today. So in light of this, I think we're in for an enjoyable time this evening as we explore the evidence for an answer to the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? Now, for me, this is one of the most interesting as well as important topics for discussion. And let me explain why. About 20 years ago, I was in graduate school specializing in the study of New Testament Greek and planning on going into the ministry. And at that time, I believed that I had a very intimate relationship with God. But I started to wonder, is this really the truth? Or was I self-deluded? So I decided to take a step back from my position of confidence and to ask some of the tough questions. And when I did that, I was just praying, God, lead me. And I started to look at all the evidence for Christianity and considering the evidence for the other religions and also considering the arguments for atheism. And after several years, the personal conclusion that I came to was that what I had initially believed had been revealed to me by God's Holy Spirit had now been confirmed by philosophy, science, and history. Namely, that God exists and that He has actually revealed Himself to mankind in Jesus Christ and that Christianity is true. The evidence for Jesus' resurrection at that point was strongly compelling to me and largely led me to that decision. Now, the reason Jesus' resurrection is so important is because the truth of Christianity hinges on this event. Jesus' atoning death and resurrection have been bedrock doctrines for Christianity since its inception. Therefore, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, the foundation collapses and Christianity is false. The Apostle Paul himself wrote, "If Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless." On the other hand, if Jesus did rise from the dead, then it seems that there's good reason for believing that Christianity is true. And that gives us something we're all going to have to think about. You see, I don't think it's sufficient to say, well, the evidence is good for resurrection, but I just can't believe it because my worldview doesn't allow it. Well, if that's a position you find yourself in, it may be time to find another worldview. That's why this evening's debate is much, much more than an academic discussion. The eternal destiny of our souls may very well hinge on what we do with Jesus and His resurrection. So where do we begin? Historical Jesus research. The eminent historical Jesus scholar, John Meyer, explains it as follows. He says, suppose we have a Jew, an agnostic, and a Christian. This is not a joke. A Jew, an agnostic, and a Christian, all honest historians, all well acquainted with first century religious movements. And we lock them up at Harvard Divinity School Library and we tell them you can't come out until you have hammered out a consensus statement on what we can know about Jesus based on historical research only and apart from any faith or theological considerations. That resulting document would portray what scholars refer to as the historical Jesus. Now, the real Jesus, the Jesus who walked the shores of the Sea of Galilee, may have been much, much more than the Jesus portrayed in that document, but He's nothing less. So obviously tonight, I am not going to be presenting an argument that says, the Bible says it, I believe it, and that settles it for me. It's more rather like what Tom Cruise said in the movie A Few Good Men. It doesn't matter what I believe, it only matters what I can prove. Now, with this in mind, what I want to do this evening is I want to present 3 facts for you that are strongly evidenced and are granted by a large majority, if not virtually every scholar who studies the subject, even the rather skeptical ones. Fact number 1 is Jesus' death by crucifixion. That Jesus was crucified and died through the process is granted by virtually 100% of all scholars who study the subject today. His crucifixion, his death by crucifixion, is attested not only in Christian sources, but in non-Christian sources as well. Now, crucifixion and the tortures that preceded it was an unspeakably cruel process. Many of us have watched Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion, and we've witnessed the brutal process of scourging used by the Romans in antiquity. Now, this is also described in other ancient writings. For example, Josephus reports of a man who was filleted to the bone with whips. In a 2nd century document called the Martyrdom of Polycarp, he mentions how the Roman whip could expose both veins and arteries. Now, the Jewish authorities had a law, and it was that when scourging a person, you could not give them more than 39 lashes. But the Romans had no such law. They could scourge a person with as many lashes as they wanted. In fact, they could scourge a person to death. Now, once this brutal process, this torture was done, then the victim was forced to carry a crossbeam out, and he was led outside the city gates. When he was then, they took nails and they impaled him to a cross or to a tree. And then the victim was left there, exposed to the elements and to scavengers such as birds, dogs, and annoying insects. It was a horrible, humiliating, and painful death. In fact, the word excruciating comes out of the cross. In the 1st century, there was an author named Seneca, and he described a person on the cross as appearing sickly, deformed, and swollen with ugly welts on shoulders and chest. Likewise, Josephus in the 1st century referred to crucifixion as the most wretched of deaths. Now, in light of this process, the majority of the medical community today has come with a near unanimous decision that Jesus died as a result of being crucified. Now, scholars, or I should say medical professionals, differ on the actual cause of crucifixion. Nevertheless, they are still very much convinced that Jesus certainly died as a result. So, let's sum up our evidence for Jesus' death by crucifixion. First, it's multiply attested by even non-Christian sources. Second, our understanding of crucifixion and the tortures that preceded it militate against the person surviving the cross. And third is we look and we find that there's the universal professional medical opinion that Jesus died as a result. So we can see that the evidence, both historical and medical, indicates that Jesus was crucified and that this process killed him. Fact number 2, the empty tomb. An impressive 75% of all scholars who study the subject acknowledge this. Now, tonight I want to give you 3 arguments for the empty tomb. The first is the Jerusalem factor. Now, Jesus was publicly executed, then buried, and then his resurrection first proclaimed, all in Jerusalem. Now, it would have been impossible for Christianity to get off the ground in that city if the body had still been in the tomb. Why all the Jewish or Roman authorities would have had to do is go to the tomb, exhume the body, tie his heels together, and drag him through Main Street in Jerusalem, and the hoax was over. But that did not happen. In fact, that leads us to our second argument for the empty tomb, and that is what the enemies of Jesus were saying. They were saying that the disciples stole the body. Now, I have a 9-year-old son, and let's suppose that he goes in tomorrow or Monday and he tells his 4th grade teacher that the dog ate his homework. Now, that indicates to the teacher he doesn't have it to turn in. And likewise, when the disciples or the Jewish leadership was saying that the disciples stole the body, this indicates that they couldn't produce it. Leads us through our third argument for the empty tomb, and that is the concept of resurrection. Woo! Wow. Okay, that doesn't like me. Oh well. Let me go back. The concept of resurrection in antiquity was that it was a bodily event. And sorry about this. Yeah, I missed it. Anyway, we'll move on. The concept of bodily resurrection in antiquity was that it was a bodily event. It actually happened to the body. Now, here's what happens. N.T. Wright, he's a very eminent New Testament historian, and he just did a book last year called The Resurrection of the Son of God. And in this 800-page volume, Wright devoted the bulk of the work to analyzing what was going on in antiquity in terms of what scholars or what the people in antiquity believed happened once a person died. Now, here's the deal. He found that the pagans, what they believed was that when a person died, they would shed the body and become a disembodied spirit. On the other hand, Jews had a couple of different views. There was a group of people who believed that there was no life after death. They were called the Sadducees. And when a person died, in their opinion, that's it. They just ceased to exist. There was no heaven for them. And so they were sad, you see. Now, on the other hand, most Jews believed in a bodily resurrection. In fact, the leading group was the Pharisees, and they believed that there was life after death. And they were fair, you see. Now, what they believed was the body that died was the body that was buried, and then on the day of resurrection, that body would be raised and transformed into an immortal body. Now, Jews and Christians aren't the only ones that believe in that resurrection is bodily. In fact, we can show up before the time of Jesus, during, and slightly after, it always meant a body. But the Islamic view of resurrection is that it's bodily as well. In the Quran, Surah 75, verses 1 through 4, it speaks that of Allah, when on the final day of resurrection, on the final day, the judgment day, that final day, God will reassemble bones and restore a person down to their very fingertips. So there's a common thread throughout Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that resurrection always involved the body. Now, it would seem then that if the disciples are saying that Jesus was resurrected, that involved the body, and of course it implies the empty tomb. Now, in light of that, we've seen some good evidence for the empty tomb this evening. William Wand of Oxford University sums it up this way. He says, all the strictly historical evidence we have is in favor of the empty tomb. And those scholars who reject it ought to recognize that they do so on some other grounds than that of scientific history. So, where does this leave us? Number one, we've seen that Jesus was crucified and that the process killed him. Number two, we've seen the empty tomb. But wait, there's more. Fact number three, on a number of occasions we see that the disciples of Jesus believed that he had been resurrected and had appeared to them. And not only was this disciples, but it was the foes of Jesus as well. Let's deal with the first group, and that would have to do with the friends of Jesus, his disciples. This is testified by eyewitnesses who knew the disciples, namely Paul and Clement of Rome. These, again, they knew the disciples, and they were saying that the disciples were claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. In addition, there is early oral tradition referred to as kerygma. It comes from the Greek word kerugma, which means the official and formal preaching of the disciples. And when we look at this, we find that the kerygma refers to resurrection. In fact, let me give you the primary example. It's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 7, in what scholars have identified as a creed. Now, in this creed, it says that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. Then he appeared to Peter, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 at one time, most of whom are still alive, but some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. And then after that, Paul says he adds his own name to that list. Now, I wish I had time to get into how scholars and why they date this to within 5 years of the crucifixion and trace it to the disciples themselves. I don't have time, but if Mr. Ali would like to challenge this finding of the majority of scholars, I'd be happy to deal with it in the remainder of our debate this evening. In the meantime, we can conclude that the disciples were claiming that Jesus had been resurrected and had appeared to them. But we can go further. No less than 7 sources in antiquity attest that they were willing to suffer and die for those convictions that Jesus had been resurrected. Now, I'm not saying, and I want to be clear on this, I am not saying that this proves that Jesus rose. Because certainly people of other religious beliefs, and even non-religious beliefs like communism, they are willing to suffer and die for their convictions. However, we wouldn't accuse people who suffer and die for their convictions for dying for a known lie. And thus, we can show that the disciples were not only claiming that Jesus had been risen, but they really believed it. Liars make poor martyrs. That brings us to our second group of people, and that is the foes of Jesus. I want to look at right now one of the major foes, and that is Paul. Now, the record states that Paul was a persecutor of the church. He was arresting, beating, consenting to the deaths of Christians, and then he converted to one because he claimed that he experienced a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus, and it totally transformed his life. This testimony is documented not only by Paul himself, but confirmed by Acts, and also further corroborated by a very early oral tradition that said, "He who persecuted the church now promotes the faith he once sought to destroy." So we have both early, eyewitness, and multiple testimonies to this fact. Folks, this is the kind of data historians drool over. But we can go further because not only did Paul claim this, we can say he really believed it because 7 sources attest that he was willing to suffer and die for those convictions. We go to another foe, and that would be James. Now, this is going to be the only time this evening that as evidence for the resurrection, I'm going to appeal to the Gospels because I like data which is much earlier, and that way we can avoid discussions over the trustworthiness of the Gospels or the inerrancy of the New Testament. I want to go with facts that I can prove, and that's why I'm focusing on that. Nevertheless, historians still believe the testimony, the embarrassing testimony of the Gospels, that James, the brother of Jesus, as well as all of Jesus' brothers, were non-believers up through the time of his crucifixion. Then shortly afterward, we find James as a leader in the Church of Jerusalem. And then we find that 3 non-biblical sources, even a non-Christian source, says that James was willing to die, and did, for his beliefs that Jesus had been resurrected. What accounts for this transformation? Most scholars answer that by saying it's the appearance to James, and that it's reported in that early creed in 1 Corinthians 15 I mentioned a moment ago. Paula Fredrickson of Boston University comments, "I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus." That's what they say, and then all the historic evidence afterwards we have attest to that, the fact that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know that as an historian, that they must have seen something. Let's go ahead and sum up our 3 facts then this evening. Number 1, Jesus' death by crucifixion. Number 2, the empty tomb. And number 3, the appearances to both friend and foe. At least that's what they believed had happened, that Jesus had been resurrected and had appeared to them. Let's go ahead and build a case now based on those 3 facts. We've seen that these facts are strongly evidenced historically and that they're granted by an impressive majority, if not virtually every scholar who studies the subject, including skeptical ones. We've also seen that Jesus' resurrection, we can see, easily explains all of these facts and without any strain. So in the absence of any plausible alternate theories to account for these facts, Jesus' resurrection can be accepted with confidence that it was an event that occurred. So now what Mr. Ali has to do this evening is he either has to show that the facts that I've presented, which are, again, strongly evidenced and attested or granted by virtually all scholars, that they're mistaken in this. Or he has to show that the logic of the argument that I have up here is flawed. Or he has to build a case of his own for what occurred that is at least as plausible, if not more so, than Jesus' resurrection. Until and unless he does this, I think the conclusion is sound. Jesus' resurrection is the best explanation for the historical data and should be regarded as a fact that occurred in history. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Shabir.
Yes.
You now have 20 minutes.
From anywhere, right?
Yes, indeed. You are welcome.
Right here. How's that?
Fine.
Hi. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak before you. I want to thank you, Gordon, for giving me this chance. Mike, thank you very much. And thanks very much to my friend David Wood, sitting in the audience, for his loving help today. Mike?
Is your mic not on?
Oh yes, I should use that. Yeah.
Oh.
Allow me to do a little bit of trick.
Aha.
Just like in Mel Gibson's movie, more goes on in the back room than you would be aware of. Yes, I was just thanking David for his loving help in assisting with my education. He took me to see The Passion of the Christ today, and I did learn a lot from watching that film. Now, the task before me is to explain where I stand on this as a Muslim, and I want to begin there to explain why I have not found the evidence for the resurrection to be persuasive. And I think the first point I want to make is that I am a Muslim. Gordon, you got it right in referring back to 9/11. In fact, after 9/11, I became more aware not only that I'm a Muslim, but I'm a Canadian, and how Canadian I am. Because I saw my religion being hijacked on 9/11, and then persons like myself had to come up and pick up the pieces and to explain who we are as Canadians and as Muslims. And not only did I realize that I have a job to do as a Muslim, but also I realized that I have a job to do as a Canadian and as a Canadian Muslim. And that job involves building bridges of understanding with other people. And it is in this spirit that I went out to see the Passion of the Christ today, because I do want to understand more of the faiths of my neighbors. But the fact that I'm a Muslim is what most is relevant to our discussion here tonight. Because that fact, of course, may be a bias that precludes me from appreciating the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. I want to first acknowledge that and then try to put it aside and look clearly at the facts after acknowledging my own bias. Now, the fact that I'm a Muslim has trained me to not appreciate the need for the cross, because in Islam we are taught that God forgives, and He forgives without demanding the price of sin to be paid, except in certain circumstances. There are occasions in Islamic law where one might perform a sacrifice, or one might give charity as a compensation for certain wrongs done. Or if one has wronged someone else, one is required, in addition to seeking forgiveness from God, to also repair the harm done to others, to the best of one's ability in doing that. But never in Islam do we understand that someone else might possibly, conceivably, pay for our sins. In fact, we would find it to be objectionable if such a thing were to happen. At least on the human scale, I think all human beings subscribe to the idea that it would be wrong to let an innocent person pay for the sins of the guilty. Or, if such a thing were done, if someone else paid, then there would be no forgiveness. Forgiveness means really that no one pays for your sins. Now, having been brought up as a Muslim on these beliefs, it became not easy for me to appreciate the significance of the cross that I see is placed on it in Christianity. Second, in Islam, and Mike has alluded to this in his presentation, there is a different conception of what happened regarding the crucifixion of Jesus. The crucial verse is in chapter 4, verse number 157, where it says, "Ma qataluhu wa ma salabuhu walakin shubbiha lahum." I'm giving you the original language, just like Mel Gibson would. If I'm to translate that, it means they killed him not, nor did they crucify him, but so it was made to appear to them. And those who differed concerning the matter are in doubt concerning him. For a certainty they killed him not. But God raised him to himself, and God is mighty and wise. Now, this verse has been interpreted by classical commentators on the Quran as meaning that someone else was transformed, made to look like Jesus, and that someone else was crucified instead of Jesus. So that, whereas everything appeared as though Jesus was being crucified, in fact it were not so. Now, I said classical interpreters of the Quran, and that may give the impression that these are the original and earliest interpreters, but they were not. In fact, Neil Robinson, a very able scholar from Leeds University in the United Kingdom, in his book Christ in Islam and Christianity, has traced the origins of these interpretations and found them to be originating from Iraq in the middle of the 2nd century. There is no reported saying from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that gives the details of this. Just a stark narrative, the way I've translated it from the Quranic text. Some classical commentators, on the other hand, struggle with the variety of interpretive detail that was given by various commentators. And the best summation of that I have found to be in the Tafsir al-Kabir, the big tafsir, the big commentary, by the pride of the faith, al-Razi. Now, al-Razi, after summarizing all of the various interpretations that have been offered by Muslim scholars on this, in the end he concludes by saying these interpretations are contradictory one to another, and in the end only God knows what happens. And I think that is the best Muslim position regarding what happened at the crucifixion. Now, if we were to retrace our steps and find out where all these varied interpretations came from, where did Muslim scholars get the idea that someone else was made to look like Jesus and crucified instead? These came from a variety of sources, including informers from people of other faiths in the area. There were some early Christian groups, not the earliest, mind you, from the 2nd century of Christianity forward. There were Gnostics who believed that someone else was made to look like Jesus. In the Mel Gibson movie, we saw Simon of Cyrene carrying the cross along with Jesus. And some had believed that Simon was in fact transformed to look like Jesus and was crucified instead of Jesus. And so this kind of information fed into the Muslim commentaries. But now when these commentaries are examined carefully, most modern scholars would tend today in Islam to think that something else is the reality behind the Quranic narrative. Yusuf Ali, for example, in his translation of the Quran, has it such that even though it appeared to the onlookers that Jesus had died on the cross, in fact, he had not died. Further to that, we have Muhammad Asad in the Message of the Quran, again a translation and commentary on the Quran, well rooted in the traditional tafsirs, saying also that the stories which grew up within Muslim tradition to say that someone else was put on the cross instead of Jesus is not necessarily what the Quran implies. And in fact, he found and he exposed a very difficult problem with that interpretation. What he said was that the passage... how much more time do I have? Any indication? 12 minutes. I don't want to spend all my time here on Quranic interpretation and not get to the biblical facts. I want to be sure of that. So be careful. What he said was that these stories that grew up among Muslim commentators ignored a grammatical problem that was there in the way they have interpreted the verse. And this grammatical problem was pointed out by an ancient classical scholar of Quranic tafsir, a scholar by the name of Az-Zamakhshari in his tafsir known as Al-Kashaf, the Unveiling. And what Zamakhshari said was that, in fact, when you look at the passage, it says he was made to appear to them. But it could also mean it was made to appear to them. Because in the Arabic reference, the reference who, using a personal pronoun there, could refer to him or to it. And he said that if in fact this verse is referring to the crucified person, that the crucified person was made to look like Jesus, that crucified person should have previously been mentioned so that the referent could be attached to him. See, if you're telling a story and you said, he said, we want to know who is this he. But if this person was just mentioned a little while ago, we know this is referring to that person. If the person was not mentioned, you have to introduce him by name. And so Zamakhshari pointed out that this could not be a reference to the crucified individual. But the classical commentators were basing their commentary on the idea that this referred to Jesus. But Zamakhshari pointed out that in fact it couldn't refer to Jesus because it was not Jesus who was made to resemble someone else, according to their explanation. It was someone else who was made to refer to Jesus. And Zamakhshari proposed instead, even though he himself did not reach the logical conclusion of his proposal, he proposed that the verse actually means it was made so to appear to them. As in the Arabic expression, khuyila lahum. It seemed so to them. So now, many modern commentators would follow that interpretation and say that what the verse is saying is that even though it appeared to them that they had crucified Jesus, in fact they had not done so. Now we can develop that further if we have more time, and I will deal with this probably in response to your questions or to Mike's probing. But the point is just simply this now. In the final summation, this verse of the Quran does not necessitate the belief that someone else was put on the cross instead of Jesus. But it leaves open the possibility that Jesus did not actually die on the cross. And this, in a nutshell, is the Muslim belief, that even though the enemies thought they had Jesus, thought they had him killed, they were not successful in doing that. Now, if you've seen the Mel Gibson movie, you'd be sure the guy died. You'd wonder if he didn't die before actually reaching the cross with all of the tortures he has gone through. But when we have time, I will take apart and deconstruct that movie and show you where Mel has in fact improved upon the facts in order to get that conclusion firmly fixed in our minds. But now, so far I have said that because of my Muslim background, I am not predisposed to find the evidence for the resurrection persuasive. But that does not mean, however, that if the evidence is put before me that I should deny it simply because I'm a Muslim. I think myself to be a reasonable individual. I study, I read these books, and I try to find out what Christian scholars have said about the resurrection, what proof they have offered. I've listened to Mike carefully, and his arguments are not new. I found them in the writings of other apologists, some of whom I've debated with, such as Dr. William Lane Craig. And I have studied in detail some of the commentaries on the biblical passages, especially the ones which are more relevant. And I'd like to tell you why I do not find the evidence so persuasive. I think two reasons. One is that I couldn't find it persuasive that Jesus actually reappeared to his disciples in a physical bodily form. And second, I could not be persuaded, given the gospel evidence alone, that Jesus, in fact, actually died on the cross. Now, usually, if a person lived 2,000 years ago and he's no longer around, we assume that he is dead. But if someone comes and tells us that a certain person who was executed 2,000 years ago was actually seen alive a few days later, we'll be asking two questions as reasonable individuals. First, we'd be asking, not necessarily in that order, but we'd be asking, are you sure you really saw him? And the second thing we'd be asking is, I have to check my mics. Are you sure he was really dead? So let's look at the two in order. Are you sure he was really dead? Now, Mel Gibson is quite imaginative, and what he has done is that he has actually improved upon the information that is given in the Gospels, and he has imagined the worst possible tortures that a person could go through in crucifixion, and he has put them all into the movie till it really becomes too much. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. John Heyman's film, which has been widely distributed by Christian groups a couple of years ago, and of which I had the pleasure of watching the Egyptian Arabic version, so I can learn a little bit of Arabic along the way as well, I found to be more true to the gospel narratives and more reasonably historical than Mel Gibson's movie. And the tortures which Jesus has endured in John Heyman's film are nothing close to what he endures in Mel Gibson's. And nobody died watching John Heyman. Now, scholars who have combed the narratives in the Gospels have tried to understand what caused Jesus' death. As Mike told us, even though everyone would agree that Jesus died on the cross, as historians, they couldn't agree as doctors as to what caused his death. And this is amply elaborated in the book entitled The Death of the Messiah by Raymond Brown, a 2-volume book, a magnum opus, a book highly recommended by even conservative Christians. In fact, Raymond Brown is a noted scholar. I mentioned Dr. William Lane Craig, who will be no stranger to you folks. Dr. Craig refers to Raymond Brown as one of the greatest New Testament scholars of our present time. Bruce Metzger said that if you can own only one book on the New Testament, let it be Raymond Brown's Introduction to the New Testament. An extraordinary work. Now, Raymond Brown warned us, what could have caused the death of our Lord? He said, because crucifixion does not usually cause the piercing of any vital organ. So what caused his death? Now, Mel Gibson goes out of his way to try and show us the worst imaginable tortures of Jesus till he has the Roman authorities having Jesus on the cross and turning the cross over so they can bend the nails that have protruded after going through the patibulum of the cross. And that is unreal. Because if anyone has actually used hammers and nails, you know that once a nail has gone into wood like that, it's pretty firm. You can hang 10 men on a nail like that. You got these something like 8-inch long nails going through wood that is about 6 inches thick, maybe even thicker than that. There's no need to bend it on the other side to make sure it holds. But Gibson has them turn Jesus over with the cross and slam face down. You wonder, wouldn't he die just from that? And then when they're done with that, they have to bring him back up the way they need him. So slam the other way, and you wonder if his back is not broken, every single bone of it. But if we take just the narratives the way they are, given in the text, one would not be sure that Jesus actually died on the cross. The second point that I wanted to make about this is that in reading the narratives, I could not be persuaded that they actually saw Jesus back from the dead. Now, of course, when you read the narratives today, you see that there are many, including the Gospel according to John, in which there are at least 3. But when you comb back past through these narratives and you look at the evolution of the text over time, you realize that the later Gospels are improving the story for you. So in Mark's Gospel, you do not have any actual narrative showing that Jesus reappeared to his disciples, except in an ending which is known today to not be originally from Mark. It's a later addition into his Gospel. Then you go to the later Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and you can see that right before your eyes, the stories are being improved. And that tells us that over time, as the stories were told and retold, they took on certain improvements to become what they are now. So now, when we think about what happened, we can be quite convinced that Jesus died because we're reading them all together, putting them all together in our minds. When we read the Gospels about the reappearance of Jesus from the dead, we are reading all of them together and thinking that all of these details are true. But what scholars have noted is that, in fact, these stories have evolved over time. So if you have, for example, in Luke's Gospel, Jesus appearing to his 12 disciples, or rather 11, because the one had betrayed him, on the day of Easter, John has the dramatic reappearance of Jesus a week later, so that he can appear to Thomas, and the doubting Thomas can verify that Jesus is here for real. But in order for John to do that, he had to make Thomas absent on the first occasion. So that whereas Luke has him appearing to all of his disciples, the 11, John says Thomas was absent. This leaves the opening for Jesus to come back a week later and appear to the doubting Thomas. So when we read the stories, we see then that the gospel writers themselves have improved the stories. And if we are to peel back the improvements and study the text historically, we could not be convinced that Jesus actually died on the cross and also reappeared to his disciples in a physical, bodily form. Those historians who agree that he died are agreeing what historians would normally agree with. If somebody lived 2,000 years ago and is no longer with us, then he is dead, according to the rules of history. But if someone claims that he reappeared to his disciples in a physical, bodily form, such as to lead to the conclusion that he resurrected from the dead, then we should be asking 2 questions. Was he really dead? Examining the narratives does not persuade me that he was actually dead on the cross. And second, examining the narratives, peeling back the later layers of improvements, does not persuade me that he actually reappeared to his disciples in a physical, bodily form. Now, Muslims and Christians can still believe that Jesus was raised up by God, but that, of course, is something that we cannot prove, and even though I believe that, it is not something I'm here to demonstrate and prove. Thank you very much.
As we mentioned earlier, we're not doing a formal debate, and we're going to enter into something that's somewhat creative in regards to debate. We're picking up something from television, Crossfire is a title anyway, and our next 15 minutes will involve Mike asking questions of Shabir, and then we'll exchange that and go back and forth a couple of times, and I think you'll find this interesting.
How you doing, Shabir?
Oh, very good, Mike.
It's really great to meet you today.
Oh,
Let's see. You started off. Well, let me go with what you said last here about the developing legend within the Gospels. You spent some time talking about how the traditions of the resurrection narratives had developed embellishments over time, and there were some legendary additions and so forth, and so therefore we shouldn't believe the accounts at all. In my opening speech tonight, I was pretty careful to discuss evidence that predates the Gospels by decades. In fact, stuff which goes back to the original disciples themselves. And so I think the Gospels are reliable, but let's just say for a moment, in fact, I'd be happy for the remainder of our debate this evening to just concede for the sake of argument. The Gospels are filled with errors and contradictions, we'll say. How does that impact the evidence that I provided, which, again, comes decades earlier? I mean, it seems to me that what happened is you're assaulting this hill and you're throwing grenades and we're seeing explosions, but I'm on this other hill and I'm saying, what's he doing over there? My army's on this hill. And how would you respond to that?
Well, the evidence which you have cited showing that there was an early acknowledgement that Jesus reappeared to his disciples is not something that historians deny, or that what I have presented denies. You have evidence that there was a blossoming Christian faith. People believed that Jesus is alive. Muslims believe that Jesus is alive. But the belief that someone is alive and in heaven with God does not necessitate his bodily resurrection. In the Gospels themselves, you have it that Jesus proclaims that Abraham and Moses are alive. They're alive with God. But the belief that they're alive does not necessitate their bodily resurrection. So it is quite possible that the disciples of Jesus, witnessing the crucifixion event, later on came to the conclusion, for whatever reason, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And that conclusion does not necessitate finding his tomb empty and knowing that he physically, bodily resurrected from the dead. It is just a faith expression of the closeness that Jesus had with God and the conviction of his disciples that God did not leave Jesus alone to suffer in this horrible way.
I think I'd have to take issue with that, because when we go back to the earliest tradition, like, for example, the creeds, there's several of them peppered throughout the New Testament, but let's just, we talked about 1 Corinthians 15, that he died, and that he was raised, and that he appeared. In Romans chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, and the majority of scholars acknowledge that we have an actual early formula or oral tradition there. It says that he was declared the Son of God with power by the Spirit of holiness through his resurrection from the dead. So in the various early traditions, in fact, that would predate Paul, that predates everything, those references. There are, I counted, 3 creeds themselves within the New Testament that would predate Paul and go back to within just a few years. In fact, James D.G. Dunn says that the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 dates to within months of the crucifixion. So we have very early, and it goes back to the disciples. Paul himself mentions resurrection or rise from the dead on 30 occasions. So we have a total of 33 references in the New Testament, very early, predating the Gospels, and a number of those predating even Paul, that talks about Jesus being dead and raised, or resurrection. And of course, as I mentioned, the concept of resurrection, the body that was buried is the same body that's raised and was transformed into an immortal body. And the testimony of the disciples is that's the body that appeared to them.
Well, I think you have to be aware that the creeds that you're referring to, have been identified by scholars combing the New Testament, looking at the writings of Paul. They look at Romans, as you've mentioned. They look at 1 Corinthians. You didn't mention Philippians, but it's there in the back of your mind as another one of the kerygmas that scholars have identified as early statements of faith. But notice that Paul does not say where he got these from. And Paul, in adding his own adding himself to the list of people to whom Jesus appeared, is adding to that list a person to whom Jesus appeared somehow spiritually. Because in the Acts of the Apostles, where the appearance to Paul is described, it is not a physical bodily appearance, but it is a blind flashing light from out of heaven. So once Paul has added that, I think your case becomes weak here, and it becomes more like the case of those who say that the disciples of Jesus must have seen an appearance of Jesus, and Muslims should be willing to grant that God, in order to solace the companions of Jesus, allowed them to see a spiritual vision of Jesus that would persuade them that Jesus is alive with God, so that they can go forward and preach the Christian faith, despite the fact that Jesus died this horrible death, which would mark him off in the eyes of people as a condemned criminal, a blasphemer, and a false Messiah. So none of the evidence you have cited actually proves that Jesus physically, bodily, rose from the dead.
Okay, I appreciate you saying that. Actually, I don't think that what Paul saw on the road to Damascus was a bodily appearance or a spiritual vision or appearance like you're saying. But I'm glad you grant Acts, because if you want to do that, then we'll go to Acts 13, where Paul is preaching as well. And there he very distinctly and precisely says bodily resurrection. He contrasts King David with Jesus, and he says, David died, was buried, his body decayed. Jesus died, was buried, and his body also, but his body did not decay. Rather, God raised it up, and of that we are all eyewitnesses. So in doing so, he's certainly contrasting what happened to David with Jesus and saying Jesus' body did not decay. He raised it up, and we're eyewitnesses to this. Now, if you mention Paul, we have to also say, even if we do take that appearance in Acts chapters 9, 22, and 26, where he sees him on the road to Damascus, and it's the bright light, this is a post-ascension appearance. So that could certainly account why the difference. It's the disciples saw him right after he had been raised from the dead, but Paul is seen after he ascended to heaven. And Paul elsewhere in his own writings is very clear about bodily resurrection. For example, in Romans 8:11 he says, the Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. So certainly referring to bodily resurrection there. And then you have Colossians 2:9, where it says, in Christ all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form, and he's using the present tense, and of course this is after post-ascension, so Paul's view is still that Jesus is in a body. There's numerous references like this, so I would just have to disagree with you that he's referring to a vision or a spirit here. And then in terms of where he got the information from, in Galatians chapter 1, verse 18 and 19, he says that 3 years after his conversion, which would have been about 5 years after the crucifixion, he goes up to Jerusalem to meet with the disciples, and he meets with Peter. He says, I met with Peter, and the Greek word used there is hysteresis, from which we get the English word history. And the word would mean that he went up and he did this historical investigation. He was asking for history of Jesus from Peter. And many scholars believe that this is at the point where Paul received this creed in 1 Corinthians 15 and all this, because he was asking a history of Jesus, and that's where he would have received the information from.
Well, I think you've said it yourself, Mike, that there is an assumption there that Paul got this from Peter, but Paul doesn't actually say that. And we have to assume that Paul got it from there. Moreover, where Paul speaks about bodily resurrection elsewhere, that does not necessarily mean that Jesus' resurrection was of the same sort. You cannot say that because things generally happen a particular way, every specific case happens as the general case. Moreover, once Paul has been added to that list of appearances, you cannot preclude the fact that others receive a similar appearance to the one that Paul received, which is something like a blinding light, something like a spiritual, a non-physical appearance, not Jesus appearing in a bodily form, but a blinding light in heaven. And when you put us all together, you realize that what Mel Gibson, for example, has shown in the movie, that Jesus is sitting there in the tomb, and we get a chance to see in the tomb that nobody else has seen 2,000 years ago. This is exactly the kind of evidence we would have liked to have, and we don't have. So finally, we should say that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus from the dead is lacking. And if Muslims and Christians believe that God miraculously raised Jesus into heaven in a mysterious way that we do not know how, and that we do not need evidence for, but we accept on faith, this would be fine. But you have made it necessary, and other apologists like yourselves have made it necessary to prove that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And this is where you are in the difficulty.
I don't see it as a difficulty because, can I just respond to that?
Sure.
Because the disciples themselves made it an issue. They claimed resurrection. That's what their claim was.
Yeah, but you see, they didn't make this the issue that they must prove. It was Paul who made this the issue. Because it was Paul who said, I've decided to know nothing else but Christ and Him crucified. It was Paul who said, and you quoted him, that if Christ is not raised from the dead, then the Christian faith is vain. But why should it be so? Why couldn't the suffering of Jesus, as in the Passion, be enough to base one's faith in Jesus? Why couldn't all of His miraculous teachings, His healings, all of His beautiful teachings which are found in the Sermon on the Mount, why couldn't that be the basis for Christian faith? Why does He have to resurrect from the dead?
God
Okay,
could have
now
done
we're,
things
now
any
we're
way He
starting to
wanted.
shift questions here, which is part of the intention, to have these parties just unlock and step back a little bit, take a breath, and now we'll shift the initiative at this point to Shabir. He can pick up and carry on, or move on to other topics.
Yes. Mike, in your presentation, you presented what you called three irrefutable facts. And they're facts you think that have been agreed upon by everyone. One is the death of Jesus on the cross. Two is the empty tomb. And third, His reappearance to His disciples. Now, if you trace the logic of where I was actually leading with my questions, I've already started the question period for you. Now, where you have actually put yourself in a difficulty here is with first acknowledging that it is historically certain that Jesus died on the cross. Now, the circumstances of His death would mark Him off as a blasphemer. As a Muslim, I believe in Jesus, but I believe in Him by virtue of my belief in the Quran. I've said that in my opening presentation. But what Christian apologists are asking me to do is to leave my Quran aside, to say that this is not historical. I must go with the information that is there in the Gospels, based on which the historical conclusion is that He certainly died under Pontius Pilate. Now, if He certainly died under Pontius Pilate as a blasphemer, as a curse of God, as Paul would put it, and that is certain, and if the evidence for His resurrection from the dead is not certain, but you can say 75% of scholars agree on that, and of course you mean evangelical conservative scholars.
Oh, not at all.
And if you say scholars who study it, you're not referring to scholars who have just dismissed it and do not bother even to look at it.
Yes,
Now, because of course of other conclusions that have already been firmly fixed, conclusions that they know about the history of the Gospels, the way they have been written, and so on. So now, having backed yourself into that corner, you have to provide irrefutable evidence that He also resurrected from the dead. And that is the evidence which you do not have, because you have Gospels which have been evolved over time. The earliest Gospel, the Gospel according to Mark, does not have the ending which we would love to see, Jesus reappearing to His disciples. Somebody had to fix that in later on. You have the later improvements that I've spoken about. How do you respond to that?
Well, as far as the irrefutable evidence, that is a tall burden of proof right there. I don't think we can do that for anything. I mean, we can't prove anything with 100% certainty. I can't prove that I'm 42 years old. For all I can prove, I mean, I was created, everything here was created 5 minutes ago, and we were given memories of events that never took place and food in our stomachs from meals we never ate. I can't prove that that's not the case. What we have to look for is high probability and what is the most plausible explanation for the data. And from what you've given me, you haven't attacked any of the evidence at all. Regarding the Gospels, I mean, you're bringing up the Gospels again, but the evidence I provided is decades prior to the Gospels. And so attacking the Gospels, again, for the sake of our debate this evening, I'm more than happy to grant that the Gospels are totally unreliable and filled with errors and contradictions. I don't believe that, of course. All right, but for the sake of our debate, I'm willing to, because I want to get our debate focused on the evidence, which is that I presented, which is decades before the Gospels. And so you questioned the death of Jesus, you said. And on what basis do you do that again?
Okay, now you switched to questioning.
Forgive me, I'm sorry. Forgive me. You're in control.
Yeah, first I should remind you, Mike, that I did not say that none of the gospel is reliable. But I did say that the Gospels have evolved over time. And once we peel back the layers of evolution in the Gospels, we realize that in the earliest strata, there is not sufficient evidence to conclude that Jesus both died on the cross and resurrected from the dead, or that he reappeared to his disciples. Once we acknowledge that, and you have the earliest strata of evidence, which is prior to the Gospels, which you mentioned, and we see that in the earliest strata, which you mentioned, there is no firm declarative statement that Jesus physically, bodily raised from the dead, then we can see the evolution even starting with those declarations. From the declarations of Paul, that Jesus reappeared to his disciples, and that this forms the bedrock of Paul's emerging faith. Naturally, the Gospels, which would be written later by followers of Paul, would want to prove that Jesus actually physically rose from the dead. And they have taken the story further. And so we see one stage in Mark, we see a further development in Matthew, a further development in Luke, and then the final development in John's Gospel. And a further development in Mel Gibson's movie. So there are improvements along the line. What Mel Gibson has done is nothing new. This is what the gospel writers have done too. They have improved, they have told the story the way they thought it should have been told. And Mel Gibson has done that. We need to see Jesus sitting there. We need to see Jim Caviezel back alive without any stripes on his body, just the one little nail wound in his palm, where it shouldn't be anyhow. So Gibson has told it the way it ought to be told. Each gospel writer in his own time has told it the way he thought it ought to be told. Given this evolution of the Gospels, peeling back to the earliest strata of tradition, can you be satisfied in the earliest strata of tradition Jesus actually died on the cross and that he reappeared to his disciples in a physical bodily form? Offer evidence of that.
I have. It's the early oral traditions and Paul himself. You mentioned the Gospels, but again, I'd like to express I'm willing to grant you the Gospels have legend and errors and all kinds of problems for tonight's debate. But I'm still on this other hill, and I'm waiting for you over here. Now, you had mentioned about... No, I'm not going to ask you a question. I'm sorry. You said that no...
You can't just wait and let him ask the question.
Okay. I'll wait for that. No statement that Jesus died in the earliest strata. Well, yes, there is. I mean, in that creed that was within 5 years, and James Dunn, in his new book, Jesus Remembered, said that the tradition in this creed dates back to within months of the crucifixion. Months. And the creed says that he died, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day. And then you go down a couple of verses later. What's really interesting is Paul says in verse 1, I'm going to preach to you the gospel. And then he gives the creed in verses 3 through 8. And then in 9 he says, hey, whether it's me or they, the apostles, the disciples, we preach Jesus and him crucified. In other words, or I'm sorry, I'm mixing up, forgive me. He says, we're preaching about the resurrection of Jesus. So there Paul's saying he's preaching the same thing as the disciples are. You go down a few more verses, I think it's verse 14, and he calls this kerygma. In other words, he's identifying it as the formal and official preaching of the disciples. So, I mean, this is very early tradition. And then we have Paul again. He mentions resurrection or dead and raised 30 times in his writings. And then you've also got the creed in Romans chapter 1, verse 3 and 4 that talks about declared the Son of God with power by his resurrection from the dead. So resurrection is in the earliest strata. There is nothing earlier. We can go trace it back to the disciples themselves. So you could say that they're mistaken, perhaps, or, I'll let you raise the theory there. But they interpreted their experiences as being resurrection, which means they understood Jesus of dying. They understood that the body that died was the body that was raised and appeared to them. And so therefore the tomb was empty.
Yes, I can see that you feel that I'm not really dealing with your points, but in fact, if you listen carefully, I have been dealing with your points all of the time, because, look, you have said fact number one, that Jesus died on the cross, and I'm saying the earliest strata of tradition cannot convince you that Jesus actually died on the cross. Now, it's for you to respond to this, but let me lay them all out. First, notice in Mark's gospel that Pilate has a doubt that Jesus actually died, and for good reason, because crucifixion usually took several days to kill a person, and in Mark's gospel, Jesus was only on the cross for a few hours. And all of the beatings that are there in Gibson's movie are just imagination, because Mark does not give you any of those details. It is true that some such beating could have been possible for a crucified victim in the Roman world, but notice also that Pilate was sympathetic towards Jesus. He found him innocent and sought to release him, but he was pressured into agreeing to have Jesus crucified beyond his will. And I think Mel Gibson had it right when he showed the difficulty that Pilate was in there, and he was caught between a rock and a hard place. He finally agreed to have Jesus crucified, but giving that reticence from Pilate, it is possible that his men would not have delivered to Jesus the most brutal punishment possible, and that finally Jesus might not have died on the cross. The one thing that might have killed him would have been the spear wound. But that is mentioned only in the Gospel according to John. That is the last of the four Gospels, remember, and that represents the last strata of evolution among the Gospels. And if that spear wound was delivered, you would be sure that all of the Gospel writers would mention it, because it's such a pertinent fact that would finally prove that Jesus died, or at least give strong evidence for that case, and they do not mention it. The scholars think today that this is an imaginative detail added by John's Gospel in order to prove against the Docetists that Jesus was actually flesh and blood, because we have here the blood and water proving that he is actually real flesh and blood. He's not here as a spirit on the cross, as some Docetists believe. And so we have, within the earliest strata, no firm evidence that Jesus actually died on the cross. So I've dealt with you fact number one. About the empty tomb. Now, historians...
I'm sorry, can I get a moment to
Please,
respond to that?
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
You're still dealing with the Gospels. And I'm appealing to this very early evidence, which predates it by decades.
But
from
see,
the
I've
Gospels.
answered that. I've shown that this earliest evidence, first of all, the sources are not known. If you cite James Dunn as saying that this was early, that's James Dunn's guess. I respect him as a great scholar, and I read his writings, but after all, it is a scholarly guess from one individual. Somebody else may have a different guess. And that,
just
that
name me
charisma,
any scholars
yes?
that, just name me any New Testament historians, okay? And as you know, in New Testament historians, it's largely critical. Many non-Christians, many non-believers, many atheists are in that discipline. Just name me a single New Testament scholar who doubts the death of Jesus.
Notice that I have acknowledged previously that all historians, you can include New Testament scholars, except for Muslims, would agree that Jesus died on the cross. Because it is an assumption that somebody who lived 2,000 years ago and is no longer alive is dead.
But that's not why New Testament scholars are concluding that.
Well, they are concluding that for the same reason as everyone else, that Jesus died on the cross, not because they have any irrefutable proof. And I'm not using irrefutable in the ridiculous sense in which you've treated it. You see, you have firm evidence that Jesus was on the cross and died on the cross. You've said so yourself. Everyone agrees on that. Now, do you have firm evidence that he resurrected from the dead? If someone claims that he resurrected from the dead, then we'd be wondering, did you really see him? And did he really die after all? So it is in the light of the later claim that I'm asking, did he really die on the cross? Show me the evidence that he actually died on the cross. What fatal wound killed him on the cross?
Okay.
And I've named Raymond Brown, who has gone through a long discussion on this, and finally, he cannot conclude what would have killed him. Of course, if you took him down and you buried him under 6 feet of dirt, he would have died. But that's not what happened to him. So what really killed Jesus? You said yourself, the medical doctors could not agree on what was the cause of death. So if we don't know the cause of death, the only thing we can say is that a man who lived 2,000 years ago and is no longer with us is dead. And I think that's a universal conclusion. But if you say he reappeared to his disciples, then we should go back and look to see whether he was actually dead. And we cannot find the evidence that he was actually dead, can we?
Okay. Now, I think we can. Everybody attests to it. our understanding of crucifixion militates against it, and medically the doctors are saying he died. But I do want to comment on Brown, because you mentioned about the spear wound in Brown, and that's correct. John does mention it. But John's the only one who mentions nails for crucifixion. It's not even in a crucifixion scene. He mentions that to Thomas, you see the nail wounds. He's the only one that mentions the crucifragium, or the breaking of legs. The others didn't do that either, but we don't deny that nails were used in crucifixion or that legs weren't broken. Let me give you a quote by Raymond Brown, since you like to use him. This is in Death of the Messiah, the same book that you quoted from, page 1092 and 93. People who would never bother reading a responsible analysis of the traditions about how Jesus was crucified, died, was buried, and rose from the dead are fascinated by the report of some new insight to the effect he was not crucified or did not die. And then on page 1373 he says, except for the romantic few who think that Jesus did not die on the cross, most scholars accept the uniform testimony of the Gospels that Jesus died during the Judean prefecture of Pontius Pilate. So, again, you brought up the Gospels, and I'm on this other hill, and Raymond Brown is with me.
Not really. Not really, because if you read Raymond Brown carefully from the page that you quoted, and I've read it myself as well, that's from the section in which he's dealing with fanciful, imaginative scenarios, whereas, for example, the Ahmadiyyas have claimed that Jesus walked all the way to Kashmir and he died and buried there. Or recently there was an Australian lady, Fearing, who claimed that Jesus came back and he was still alive and he got married to Mary Magdalene.
Right.
Brown was responding to this kind of imaginative detail. But Brown himself, in the section, if you've read it, dealing with the physiological cause of Christ's death, gives a different picture. In the end, he looks at the kinds of medical examinations that have been done now post-mortem, thousands of years after the fact, and he dismisses them because he says that the details that are given by the gospel writers should not be taken as actual physical details that occurred, but they are due to a number of factors, including imaginative detail added by the evangelists themselves. And you mentioned some of them. Yes, they're only in the gospel according to John. Not to deny that nails were used in crucifixion, but to say that Jesus was actually nailed to the cross, this is something that the gospel writers wrote because they thought that is how you tell about a crucifixion. But crucifixion did not necessarily involve nailing. One could have been tied as well. And notice that Gibson, in order to have the nail go in the palm, which is traditionally how it is shown, had to also have the arms tied. And notice that the other two who were condemned to be crucified, they had their arms tied to the crossbar. And it was possible to raise a person to the cross and have his arms tied, and he did not have to be nailed. So maybe Jesus was nailed. But to say that he was necessarily nailed because John says so is really to give us more to imagine. About the breaking of the legs. Again, this is doubted by historical scholars because they look at John putting this in place, and they say that John has written this in order to prove the Old Testament scripture to be true. You see, John has done what Gibson has done. What they have done is that they look at and they say, what should have happened to Jesus if we read the Old Testament right? So Gibson reads in the Old Testament that the Son of God will bruise the head of the serpent. And what does he do? He brings the serpent into the Garden of Gethsemane, so Jesus crushes the head of the serpent. Where is that in the Gospels? Gibson has put that in the movie because he thinks that is how it should have been because it was prophesied. In a similar way, scholars have found that the four gospel writers have written things into the Gospels about Jesus, not because this was physically witnessed in the life of Jesus, but because this is how the writers read the Old Testament. They thought this should have happened to Jesus, and so they wrote it. So John thought that there has to be some way in which there is an attempt, people's legs are being broken, but not Jesus's, because it was written, his legs shall not be broken. Even though that was written about the Paschal Lamb, it's something entirely different. They will look on the one whom he has pierced. Even though that is about false prophets who were pierced because they were false prophets, John brings that here about Jesus, even though Jesus is not a false prophet, and that passage had nothing to do with Jesus. But John adds these details, not because they actually physically, historically were witnessed in the life of, or around the death of Jesus, but because John thought that this should have happened, because the Old Testament said so, and he wrote it as though it happened, and the Old Testament confirmed it.
Okay.
I notice it's my turn, so how about if I just continue with that? Is that okay?
Well, let's take a break and a breath for a moment. I'm not sure if we're debating Mel Gibson or Brown or what here. I'm not sure if we're debating Mel Gibson or Brown or what here. I would like to encourage us to maybe take a step back and go at this from another direction. Consider that.
Water, perhaps?
Take a sip of water. Yeah, I've heard several of the points about 3 times, and my hunch is we're not going anywhere after you hear it 3 times. Okay, you've got the next 15 minutes, and then Shabir, you have 15 minutes after that, and then we'll be going to the audience for some questions, about a half hour. If you care to be thinking now what you would like to raise as a question, we'll go from there.
Okay.
Mike.
A few thoughts on the crucifixion. Can I say that?
If you like.
Okay.
Whatever.
You mentioned how we can't be certain nails were used. Well, in a very good book by Martin Hengel, an eminent New Testament scholar, titled Crucifixion, he lists 13 sources in antiquity where nails are used. And Josephus can be added to that list for number 14. We can probably add Tacitus to it as well as 15.
Don't mind if I interrupt you, but
Okay.
I didn't deny that nails were generally used in crucifixions, but I'm asserting that nails were not necessarily used in every crucifixion. A crucified victim might also be tied instead of being nailed.
Okay. Hengel does mention one account in antiquity where binding, tying to the cross is used, but only that it was used and as a practice in Egypt. So we really just don't have any historical kind of evidence whatsoever to show that binding was used by the Romans. Everything seems to point to nails, and so we have no reason to question that nails were used when it came to Jesus' crucifixion. And in fact, this is the uniform
Actually,
testimony.
we do. I have a book here by John Rousseau and Rami Arav, a book entitled Jesus and His World, a cultural and an archaeological and cultural dictionary. And here it is asserted that, in fact, in crucifixions it were possible to also use binding instead of nailing. So nailing was not in every
I'm sorry, what
case.
references do they use in antiquity for that rather than just making a statement?
Well, you can read the book yourself.
Well, no, this is this is an academic debate, not a lunchroom discussion. And
Yes.
you can't just say, well, this author says this. You have to provide reasons for
Yes.
it. And I'm providing reasons. I'm citing you sources. Now, if you like, I'd be happy to change.
I'll give you his references. In his bibliography, he has named here a long list, and rather than delay everyone with that, I'll show you the list. And if you would like, you can make a copy, and I can...
Okay, where's the list of what?
Here is the bibliography, just dealing with the crucifixion.
Right, but you're responsible now to show me where it says that binding is used, not just the bibliography that I have to go through and read now.
No, I don't think this is necessary, because remember, you cited Martin Hengel,
Right.
whose book I have and is sitting in my hotel room right now. Martin Hengel, you cited Martin Hengel. I did not question the integrity of the scholar. Martin Hengel is a known scholar. I respect him, and if he says that his sources lead him to this conclusion, I have no doubt in that. Here we have a couple of respectable scholars producing a respectable book with a long list just dealing with the few pages in which they have dealt with the crucifixion. So pages 74, 75, 76, 77, and a part of 78 deals with the crucifixion. Mm-hmm. And then his list of books almost fills the rest of that page. So I do not question the integrity of these scholars, and you cannot say that in the midst of a debate here, we should question the scholar who got the information from the other scholars. That would be, I think, a sticky point.
Okay, well, at least I got Josephus, I've got Tacitus. Who can you provide as a counterexample where binding was used by the Romans?
What I'm providing is a book that has been written by a couple of reputable scholars. They're not Muslim scholars. John Rousseau, Rami Arav. It's a book with a respectable presentation. It's a scholarly academic text. It's billed as a dictionary, and in fact that's what it is. It's a listing alphabetically of information of a historical nature. They're not making things up, and they have listed their bibliography. If you doubt that you want to take it up with these scholars, go right ahead. But you cannot here insist that that information is wrong without having proper proof yourself. You see, an expert witness by himself is a proof for a point. And if you want to refute that proof, you can bring other expert witnesses who say that it is not. So far, all you have mentioned is that Martin Hengel has found evidence that binding was used for crucifixions in another part of the world. But you're arguing from silence because you have not a proof from Martin Hengel that binding was not used among the Romans. And here these scholars have offered information to show that binding was used. I don't think we have any reason to doubt the integrity of these scholars. Now, if I had said it from myself, then you can challenge me, okay, Shabir, bring me your proof. I brought you the proof here. Then you ask me for the proof for the proof.
What you have shown me is a single book, and you haven't given me a statement out of it which shows that the Romans used binding. Hengel in his book does provide 13 sources where the Romans used nails. Yes. And like I said, we can add Josephus to that. We can probably add Tacitus to it because he says that Christians were affixed to crosses, the Latin term affixed, and then they were set ablaze on fire, and they wouldn't use binding or else the ropes would burn. So nails make more sense there. If we take Tacitus there, well, then that would be an additional source and bring it up to 15.
Yeah, but you see, notice that this you're arguing from silence because saying that nails were used does not deny that for some other victims, ropes were used.
Right,
and you
but
said yourself.
If all the evidence we have says nails, and we do have the 4 testimonies of the Gospels, since you're using them, I'll just point out that John mentions nails. In fact, Luke alludes to it when he says that Jesus showed his hands to them. So if that's the case, we do have 2 reports that said nails. It seems to go in with the other reports that are available. And so,
but you're not answering to my point, Mike.
Well,
my point is that because it was known that nails were generally used, the gospel writers wrote that nails were used. Not because it was historically, factually witnessed and recorded at the time, but because at the time when the disciples were writing, they wrote what normally happened at a crucifixion. Not only what normally happened, but as time went by, and they wanted to prove definitely that Jesus underwent the worst possible tortures, they improved the level of torture. So it went from Mark a little to Matthew and Luke further, and John even worse. And in Mel Gibson's movie, even further still. So I'm mentioning Mel Gibson's movie not because we're debating that, but because it illustrates what happened with the Gospels, the kind of imaginative work that went in. And the fact that Gibson can do that with us today, even though we have the written Gospels before us to see where he has actually gone off on a tangent, shows the kinds of imaginative work that could have been done before him prior to the availability of these written documents. So the first writers had much more of a latitude to present the case the way they thought it should be presented. And in fact, combing through the Gospels, this is what we find that they did. So that whereas in Mark's Gospel, Pilate is doubtful that Jesus had died so soon, in Mark and Luke, even though they are basically almost verbatim giving us the same story from Mark, they have nevertheless reworded it so that the doubt of Pilate is not expressed in Matthew and Luke. And Raymond Brown says that possibly the reason why Matthew and Luke reworded it such is so that their readers should not also doubt, like Pilate, as to whether or not Jesus had actually died. And I think that reminds me of the Quranic point, that those who differed concerning him were in doubt as to what happened, as to the matter. They were not sure that they actually killed him, and for certainly they killed him not. Some other interpretation is necessary here. And in the light of, if no one had claimed that he had resurrected from the dead, perhaps we would accept that he actually died, just like the historians do. And that's what they say, because they do not believe that he actually physically, bodily resurrected from the dead. So they say he died. But if we are to say he resurrected from the dead, then we must question, did he really die or not? And when we look at the earliest strata of evidence, there is no clear indication that he actually died on the cross.
The Gospels say he died. All of them say he died. All of the Gospels say he rose from the dead. None of them say there was any doubt. So because I can't prove that nails were used, even though that's the testimony of the Gospels, because I can't prove that ropes weren't used instead, the Gospel writers are doubting whether Jesus died and rose?
No, Mike, the Gospel writers are not doubting that Jesus died and rose. I don't think you're getting my point. The gospel writers are out to prove that Jesus died and rose. And the later the gospel, the more they try to prove it. And you can see that after the first gospel is written, some questions are raised. And the later gospels try to eliminate those questions. For example, who carried the cross of Jesus? I mentioned in my opening presentation that some second century Christians believed that Simon the Cyrene, who was made to carry the cross of Jesus, was made to look like Jesus and crucified instead. Now, the Gospel according to John says that Jesus went out carrying his own cross. And then the next thing you know, he arrives at Golgotha. So you cannot have it both ways. The first three Gospels has it that Simon the Cyrene was compelled to carry the cross because obviously Jesus was too weak to carry it. The Gospel according to John shows that Jesus is strong and powerful throughout. He doesn't get arrested, he hands himself over. Nobody dares to arrest him because they just fall back to the moment he says, I am he. Jesus hands himself over because he's deliberately dying for the sins of mankind. A very different picture than we have in the Synoptic Gospels. Now, in the Gospel according to John, because Jesus is so strong throughout, he doesn't need anybody to carry his cross, but a more important point, people were reading the other Gospels and using it as a proof that possibly Simon was in fact crucified instead of Jesus. John did not want his Gospel to be read in this particular way, and so he has it that Jesus went out carrying his own cross. He emphasizes that point. Not just simply that Jesus went out carrying his cross, but Jesus went out carrying his own cross, as it says in the NIV. There is an emphasis there because John wants to make sure that everybody knows that there's no Simon of Cyrene here to deal with. It's just Jesus. He's strong throughout. He goes up to the cross by himself. Nobody arrests him. Nobody can take his life away from him. He gives it up of his own accord. He lays it down, and he has the authority and power to take it up again. A very different Jesus, a very different gospel, a very different story, and you can see the evolution. So what you have to deal with is that evolution, and you have to show that the evidence for the actual death and physical bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead is there in the earliest strata. It is not enough to say, well, the later strata says this.
But that's not my argument. My argument has been, it's in the earliest strata. That's what I've been emphasizing. No, but yet you keep going to the Gospels. I'm saying, I'm over here on this hill.
No, but
I'm still waiting for you.
Mike, in fairness, I have actually addressed you over on that other side of the hill.
But all you're saying is the Gospels say this. It's kind of like your argument is, all right, the Gospels contain legend, therefore the sources that existed decades prior to the Gospel must be cut from the same cloth. And that doesn't necessarily follow.
No, what I've shown is an evolution. You see, the earliest stage in the belief in the resurrection of Jesus was that God somehow raised Jesus back to life, even though people had seen him dying. That God rescued Jesus and raised him to himself. That's the earliest strata.
No, it's not that he rescued him. I mean, there's nothing in the early strata that says rescue him. I mean, he presented the rescue theory, but there's no evidence for it. It's contrary to the eyewitness testimony. It's based on a single source written 600 years after Jesus with no contact with the eyewitness. And it's ad hoc. That is because it's a supernatural explanation with no evidence that's contrary to the evidence. It seems that it was constructed not so much in an attempt to rescue Jesus as it is to rescue Islam. It seems that it was constructed not so much in an attempt to rescue Jesus as it is to rescue Islam.
No, I'm not speaking of rescue here as rescue prior to death. What I'm saying is that the earliest belief in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, as we can tell from the earliest sources, is that despite the fact that everyone had seen Jesus dying on the cross, God had somehow rescued Jesus and raised him to himself, so that Peter can proclaim in the Acts of the Apostles that death could not hold him. And of course, because God was with him, rescuing him, raising him from the dead. You can put it that way if you want. You mentioned the speech of Peter, which we are now referring to.
So you did say the earliest strata talks about Jesus being raised from the dead. Do you grant that?
The earliest strata, well, we should first listen to the words, and then we'll talk about the interpretation, because there's something to be said about that. The passage which Peter is citing in the Acts of the Apostles is from the Psalms, Psalm 16. Read the commentary on Psalm 16. The New Jerusalem Bible, in its footnoting on that psalm, says that this actually refers to a person who has had a close brush with death. The psalm does not actually necessitate the person physically dying. So now to say that God raised this person from the dead does not necessarily in the ancient world require that the person had to be physically actually dead. You see, our conception of what involves death or what means death has changed over time. You mentioned previously N.T. Wright in his excellent book, This Thick, on the resurrection of the Son of God. If you read it throughout, you will see he mentions some of the conceptions that were there and some of which you refer to, but he also mentions the story Kalerho. In the story, Kalerho is beaten by her husband and she apparently dies. And she is buried, but some grave robbers come and they're surprised to find her alive. They're scared off, and Kalerho survives. And then, according to the story, as cited by N.T. Wright, she says, I was dead and I came back to life. Even though we know from the story that she was not dead. But this is how people might refer to things. If a guy is diagnosed with death today, he's kept in a morgue, he's watched for a little bit, and in fact he doesn't actually die, he might say, I came back from the dead, but we know he wasn't actually dead. Today our conception of death has actually improved because we would put a person through an EEG, through an ECG. There are certain grimacing effects that we test for, 5 of them, that are noted by Constance Jones in his book, The Complete Book of Death and Dying. And after all of these tests, we keep a person to just watch him just to make absolutely sure. So it is possible that a person might appear to be dead in the ancient world and that he wasn't actually dead. But if that person survived, one would say that he actually came back from the dead. Documentation for this is found in an excellent book by Jan Bondeson, Bonson. His book is entitled Buried Alive. A terrifying history of our most primal fear. And what he has shown here is that throughout history, there have been difficulties identifying when exactly is a person finally dead. And he showed in particular, in the time of Jesus, though Jesus was not his particular concern, he's just simply going through the whole sweep of history. What he has shown is that in that time, people could not determine when a person actually had died. And in that same book, we have a quotation, this other book here, we have a quotation from one of the Jewish Talmud sources, which might help us to understand why the women, disciples of Jesus, went to the tomb. Listen to it. It says, the Babylonian Talmud stipulates, one should go out to the cemetery and check on the dead 3 days after the funeral, and one should not fear that by doing so he follows a Gentile practice. It happened that a checkup after 3 days discovered that a certain person was buried alive. This person lived for another 25 years, had sons, and then died. And the reference is here. See, they've actually given the reference. So if you ask me now, it is there.
Okay.
So
yeah, but the Talmud, can I respond to some of this? Because you're giving me a whole lot here.
Okay, we've shifted into the next quarter, the last quarter hour.
Okay.
We will be going to you for some questions in about 12 minutes.
The Talmud is late. It's several hundred years after Jesus. So just because the Talmud mentions that in its day, when it was reporting this stuff, which could have been 300-400 years after Christ, that was the way things were done, that doesn't mean that that's the way it was done in Jesus' day. In fact, you mentioned about how we can't be certain a person's dead. Well, because we don't have EEGs, I really don't think that they would have had much doubt that John the Baptist was dead, who had been beheaded. Yes. So now, even with this thing, with the Talmud, they may have gone to the tomb to check it out to see if the person...
But you see, Mike, that is exactly my point. You see, once a person is beheaded, you're sure he's dead. But you put a person on a cross, you expect that after 3 days, through exhaustion and facing the elements and even the vultures, who might come and pluck out your eye, then by 3 days' time, you will be dead. But then, if you take him down after a few hours, even Pilate wonders, are you sure he's dead? But of course, Pilate has an interest in preserving Jesus because he didn't want Jesus crucified in the first place. So I think if you make it your job to prove that Jesus resurrected from the dead, you actually have a difficult job. If you say that Jesus rose from the dead, he ascended into heaven, Muslims and Christians can both believe that without having to prove it. Look, Jesus was one of the greatest persons who walked the earth in all of history. He was a great teacher. We remember him for his memorable sayings, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The golden rule is something something that people wish to have in every religion, and we find the parallels for that in other religions through searching. But it's such a known teaching of Jesus, such beautiful teachings from a man, the miraculous works that Muslims and Christians believe that he performed, the fact that he was born of a virgin, that he raised the dead back to life, that he cured the leper, that he healed the blind. Muslims and Christians believe that. We do not need to prove it to the world. But by making it your job that you have to prove that Jesus resurrected from the dead, and you have said that if you cannot prove this, then it would make Christianity appear to be false. You have hinged everything on this.
If it was disproved, if Christ has not been raised, then a person's faith is worthless. The burden of proof, I don't have to as a Christian. Most Christians aren't Christians because they prove Jesus rose from the dead, but they still believe it. May I comment on Pilate real quick? You mentioned there how Pilate, that he wanted to save Jesus. I guess I have two comments. You've exerted a lot of time and effort this evening undermining the Gospels, and so I'm bewildered that now you would appeal to those very texts in order to prove your point.
Because I've told you previously, I'm not saying that all of the Gospels are false. What I'm saying is that there has been an evolution among the Gospels. And in peeling back the layers of evolution, Mike, you have not touched on that at all. You have not spoken anything about the evolution of the Gospels.
Because I'm on this other hill. I presented evidence that's decades earlier. I'm still waiting for you to attack this hill. Now, the thing about Pilate, you said, okay, now Pilate wanted to rescue Jesus here. He didn't want to crucify him. And this is another thing that I'm kind of surprised at, because critical scholars normally regard this as political propaganda by the early Christians, and that it's not historical, whereas these same scholars accept the death of Jesus because it's so much more better attested. So if you're going to accept the Pilate story, then all the more you should accept the story of Jesus' death, because there's much more going for it. If you reject the Jesus death, then all the more you should reject the Pilate, because there's less going for it.
Now, you see, I think your point here is built on what we might call epistemological confusion. There is a way in which we learn things. I didn't mean to be funny about that. I'm just trying to put my thoughts together, and we have to be quick. You see, we start with certain basic assumptions. So, basic assumption: I'm a Muslim. Therefore, I believe that the Quran is the Word of God. Therefore, I believe the Quran's depiction that God raised Jesus to himself, and that his enemies did not kill him. And this might be explained in a variety of ways. Jeffrey Parenter, a Christian writer, in his book Jesus and the Quran, says that perhaps this actually means that the Jews didn't kill him because the Romans did. Or perhaps it means that whereas they thought they killed him, that they hadn't actually killed him, and it was God who killed him. And many verses of the Quran can be cited in collusion with this to show that the Quran has this outlook, that it's not the enemy that kills the righteous person of God, it is God who takes the life of the person. And moreover, it could mean that even though they had actually physically killed him, he is still alive with God. And the Quran says that the martyrs are alive with God. And that would reflect back with what I said about Abraham and Moses from the lips of Jesus himself. And so from that epistemological perspective, there are many different conclusions that I can form. Now, if I leave that situation behind and pretend for a moment that I'm not going with the Quran, then I have to turn to the Gospels and the histories that are built on the Gospels. Now, if I take the position of the historians, as you were suggesting I would do, and deny that Pilate was reticent, and if I perceive of Pilate as a very brutal individual who wanted Jesus dead, then I would conclude with other historians, with Michael Grant, for example, in his book An Historian's View of the Gospels, and other such historians, that Jesus actually died on the cross, and that he did not physically, bodily resurrect from the dead, that his disciples had an extraordinary vision of him, because his disciples wanted so badly to believe that Jesus was alive with God, and so they wanted to believe it so badly that they saw him.
And this would apply to Paul too?
Say again?
Paul and James, they didn't want to see him alive. And what about the empty tomb? Empty tomb I think, does away with the vision theory.
No, well here, Paul's vision, as you're saying, as an enemy of Jesus. There is something to say about Paul's vision. Because Paul himself, in his first letter to the Corinthians, he said that that the devil might appear as a bright, shining light, so that many might be deceived. So Paul's testimony that he saw this light cannot be a full and final convincing argument of a physical nature that Jesus physically, bodily rose from the dead. Second, you mentioned James. Now, what has been found in the evolution of the Gospels over time is that starting with Mark, the family of Jesus have been given a bad rap. It's not like in the Mel Gibson movie where Mary is everywhere there with Jesus by his side and kissing his feet and getting the blood on her lips. In the Gospels, in the Synoptic Gospels, starting with Mark, the family of Jesus looked bad, and so too his disciples. And so, of course, his brothers don't believe in him. His mother doesn't even seem to understand him in Mark's Gospel. So Jesus denounces her earlier on. And so that is there for a reason, because later Christianity would follow the line of Paul, and because there was tension between Paul and the original disciples of Jesus and the family of Jesus, so Paul was celebrated, and the family and disciples of Jesus were denigrated. So James comes off as a disbeliever. And later on, he is the head of the church. Now, you have said that is because he has seen a vision of Jesus. But that's not necessarily so. If we go on that strictly historically, historians would say that the fact that James was the head of the church known in Jerusalem, that is a proof that, in fact, he was not a disbeliever in Jesus, and that, in fact, the Gospels have given him a bad rap that he did not deserve.
Okay,
so now, turn it around. You do not have still a proof.
Let's bring this to a close. We're a little off proportion in terms of who's saying what or how much is going on here.
It's difficult to follow, I know.
It is. And again, we want to keep the proportion even. Let's have you ask a final question of Mike, and let Mike respond to that before we go to questions from the audience.
Yes. Mike, I have shown in my discussion about the evolution of the Gospels how in the Gospel according to Luke, Jesus appears to the 11 disciples on Easter Day. Whereas in the Gospel according to John, Thomas was absent. Now, I've said that John has deliberately worded it this way so that he can create a new event for the further appearance of Jesus. So John is expanding the story, giving us more proof, more physical, hard evidence to deal with. How do you deal with this contradiction of facts here, and the fact that we can see that John is doing this? How do you reconcile these different appearance narratives?
I guess first I'd say I'm still on this other hill, and that's the Gospels you're referring to. But I don't think John is so much is expanding as we have Luke contracting. In Luke's Gospel, it seems like everything happens on Easter. He appears to the Emmaus disciples, then he comes back. The Emmaus disciples come back and they say, hey, the Lord appeared to us. And the disciples say, yeah, he is risen. And he appeared to Peter. And then Jesus appears in their midst, and then he comes out and commissions them as well. So it seems like everything happens in Jerusalem on Easter in Luke. But in Luke's sequel, Acts, you go to chapter 13, verse 31, and he says that Jesus, after having been raised, he met them in Galilee and accompanied them back in Jerusalem. So he kind of expands a little bit there and tells this.
I don't think you have the citation correct. I'm sorry.
No, it's 1331.
Yeah, the reference is correct, but what you're citing is not in there. You see, what Peter is saying is that Jesus did not appear to everyone, but only to those who had accompanied him from Jerusalem, from Galilee rather.
Right,
so
right,
it's not
but that's the disciples there.
Yeah, but you see, you're putting it differently. You're saying that Jesus appeared to them in Galilee and then accompanied them all the way back to Jerusalem. Whereas, what Peter is saying there is that Jesus did not appear to everyone, but he appeared only to those disciples who had accompanied him in the first instance all the way from Galilee to Jerusalem.
All right, here's what it said. But God raised him from the dead, and for many days he appeared to those who came up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem, who are now his witnesses to the people. So my point is this. Luke says it's from Galilee to Jerusalem. So he's talking about these different appearances, whereas Luke in his gospel contracts them into one day and one appearance, a couple of different appearances, Emmaus disciples to Peter, to all of the disciples at that point. So the way I answer the question you're giving is that John is not expanding in his gospel. Luke is contracting in his gospel as evidence from what we have in 13:30.
Can you read us the same verse from the NIV?
Sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Actually, I was looking at it in Greek. And for many days, please don't laugh. I didn't mean that to be funny, and I really want to make sure we have good communication up here. And for many days, he was seen by those who had traveled with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. They are now his witnesses to our people.
Mm-hmm. So this is not necessarily saying that Jesus appeared to them in Galilee and then kept accompanying them. You're not talking about the resurrected Jesus being in the company of the disciples traveling from Galilee to Jerusalem here. You're talking about Jesus appearing to those disciples who had previously accompanied him all the way from Galilee to Jerusalem. I mean, we know what that reference is too, because the whole Gospels were about that. The disciples, along with Jesus, making a long journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. It's not post-resurrection, it's pre-crucifixion.
Oh, I don't see that at all. In fact, that's not what it's saying there. And in Mark, if you go back to the earliest gospel source, you really like the Gospels this evening, so I'll go to them. In Mark, chapter 16, verse 7, the angel tells the women to go tell the disciples to go meet Jesus in Galilee as he told you. And then you go back to chapter 14, verse 28, where Jesus says, after I have been raised, I will go ahead of you and meet you in Galilee.
So in Mark you have the promise,
right?
And of course the later Gospels will deliver that promise. But in Mark's Gospel, the promise is not actually delivered. The angel repeats the promise.
Right.
But then in Matthew's Gospel, it's delivered. And so Matthew even has the angel's
Are you suggesting that an appearance didn't take place in Mark?
What I'm saying is that Mark does not report the actual appearance.
Right.
That would come later.
But are you saying that Mark was unaware of an appearance?
We don't know what's in the mind of Mark. But if Mark does not give us the actual report of the appearance, then we do have an evolution here among the Gospels. An earlier Gospel promising that Jesus will appear, but doesn't say he actually appeared.
Right, but if you want to base it on ifs and stuff, I don't think that's very strong.
But there's no if. But there's no if, Mike.
Okay.
Yes.
Take a breath, guys. We have mics in the back here, and what I will do is probably go from one to the other. And I would like to invite people to ask a question, address it to one or both of our speakers here.